Good morning and welcome to the Global Current. Today on the show, we'll hear reports on ethnic violence in China, a transitioning government in the Central African Republic, threats against former President Musharraf of Pakistan, and news on the foiled bomb plot in China. I'm Alicia Sharabali, and thank you for joining us. First up, Staffer Argentone provides a look at the clashes between Muslim Uyghurs and ethnic Han people in China's Xinjiang province.
China's Xinjiang province is once again the site of internal turmoil, as its residents have renewed fighting over land in the region. The conflict has tones of both planned terrorist campaigning and racial conflicts. The resurgence in violence has come as Muslim Uyghurs have been clashing with the mostly ethnic Han regional authorities, resulting in devastating death and destruction. Beijing has increased security forces in the region in recent weeks as fighting between the two groups has escalated. Since 2009, there have been about 200 deaths. Muslim Han and other ethnicities have suffered losses due to fighting in the region. Many observers have classified this struggle as a terrorist campaign, largely due to the choice of targets by the opposing forces. The conflict is similar to conflicts seen around the world that put progress and tradition in direct opposition. The ethnic Han, by far China's most dominant people, have in recent years begun migrating to the region, seeking to invest in different industries. This has put them on a collision course with the Uyghurs, who do not recognize the region as under China's domain. Though China is home to more than 50 ethnic groups, the Han make up almost 92% of the population. The BBC reports that in Xinjiang province, however, Uyghurs make up about 45% of the population, and argue that the influx of Han Chinese residents has marginalized their traditional culture. But according to the Chinese government, the main perpetrators of the recent strife have been the Uyghurs. Foreign Minister Hua Xinyang categorized the Uyghurs who carried out the most recent attack as a violent terrorist group. Despite this, many of the individuals killed during the conflict were native Uyghurs. Many critics of this interpretation have argued that the sentiment was released too quickly and the incident was not properly investigated. Nicholas Bequelin, a senior Asia researcher at the Human Rights Watch, stated, "China has made many unproven and questionable statements about the terrorism in the region. That does not mean that there is anti-state violence happening there, but we should take with a lot of caution any claim of terrorism. This conflict has weakened the internal stability of the region and may lead to more clashes between the two groups. The region has had numerous reports of separatist movements, so further conflicts in the region may still arise." Argentone, Global Current.
Now, Staffer Liv Coulson details the chaotic government transition underway in the Central African Republic.
Early last week, the United Nations political chief, Jeffrey Feldman, visited the Central African Republic in order to urge rebel leaders in the country to return to constitutional rule. In late March, Francois Bouzeze, the president of the landlocked state, fled the country after rebels overran the capital of Bangui. With the ousted president living in Cameroon, rebel leader Michel Djoutadia has taken up the mantle of authority in the Central African Republic. The political transition has ushered in chaos, unchecked killing, robbery, rape, and other human rights violations. As the UN's political representative, Feldman advocated for an end to the lawlessness during his meeting with the CAR's current leadership, which included Djoutadia. Feldman gave his support for a political transition which would conform to the Libreville Agreement, an agreement both the rebels and the government signed in January. Violent political transitions are not a new phenomenon in the Central African Republic. Ousted President Bouzeze came to power in 2003 after he staged a military coup. Outraged by this unlawful transition, an armed opposition against Bouzeze's rule began in the northeastern region of the country. This rebellion acted as a spark, igniting an uprising across the country which evolved into the Central African Bush War. The Bush War lasted for 3 years, displacing thousands of civilians and scarring the countryside. The war ended in 2007 after numerous peace accords between the government and the various rebel groups involved. Many of the rebel groups with their roots in the Bush War would later unite, forming a coalition called Seleka. Beginning in December 2012, Seleka forces accused President Bouzeze of violating the peace agreements and began capturing towns in the eastern and central regions of the country. Several Central African nations, along with South Africa, sent troops to the capital of the republic in order to defend against a rebel attack. In January 2013, after representatives from both the government and Seleka signed the Libreville Agreement, peace appeared plausible. The Libreville Agreement created a system of government that allowed Bouzeze to remain in office, with reduced power. The agreement shared executive authority with the unity government, whose ministers were elected among Seleka rebels and civilian opposition. The agreement called for parliamentary elections next year and presidential elections at the end of Bouzeze's term in 2016. The document also stipulated that current leaders of the transition would not be qualified to run for these elections. Despite the arrival of African troops, Seleka rebels continued their advancement and swept into the capital of Bangui in March. The African Union called the takeover a coup d'état and indefinitely suspended the CAR's African Union membership. The AU also issued a travel ban and an asset freeze against the primary Seleka leaders, including Djudjadia. To date, African and Western powers have refused to recognize Djudjadia as legitimate president, but refer to him instead as the head of state of the transition. In a glimmer of hope that diplomacy and discussion will still hold weight amid the chaos of Bangui, Djudjadia indicated in his first official statement that he intends to implement the Libreville Agreement, stating that he would organize elections within the next 3 years. While adherence to the Libreville Agreement has the potential to defend against the emergence of dictatorship as well as provide legitimacy and stability for the new rebel government, the chaos of the current situation is unsettling. In a country already facing severe shortages of medical facilities, supplies, and personnel, insecurity throughout the country is preventing necessary humanitarian access. In response to these conditions, the UN's Feltman pleaded to the new leaders. Those who have seized power must shoulder their responsibilities and control those elements under their command. Liv Colson, The Global Current.
Heidi Erbsen, reading for Brittany Little, looks into the life of Pervez Musharraf after being charged in connection to Benazir Bhutto's death.
Pakistani police forces reported last week that they had defused 110 pounds of explosives that were allegedly hidden in a car located just outside the former Pakistani president Pervez Musharraf's villa. Police also reported that the handheld detonators were later found nearby. Pakistani officials are still unsure of who planted the explosive in front of Musharraf's villa. There is some speculation that the Taliban, who had previously threatened Musharraf, may be behind the incident. The threat against Musharraf came just weeks after he was placed under 2 weeks house arrest on April 8th. On April 20th, just 4 days before the foiled bomb plot, Musharraf was informed by the Pakistani court that his incarceration was being extended, and his house arrest order remains in effect until the next court appearance, which is not until May 4th, where he will face criminal charges stemming from his time as Pakistan's president. In 2007, Musharraf apparently failed to afford proper security protection to Benazir Bhutto, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, and the first woman to hold the office. Bhutto was assassinated in December 2007 during a campaign rally, which opponents argue is the result of Musharraf's refusal to provide adequate security. As a result of Bhutto's assassination, then-President Musharraf was barred from taking part in the national elections that were in progress at the time. In 2008, multiple lawyers filed a claim against Musharraf, formally charging him with treason, an accusation stemming from Musharraf's attempt to close Pakistan's constitution and remove some of the country's best judges from the bench. Musharraf is the first ever former president to be arrested and sentenced to prison, though due to the multiple bail extensions he has received, many doubt whether Musharraf will ever find himself behind bars. His return to Pakistan last week was the first time back in the country for Musharraf since he resigned as president and voluntarily exiled himself to Dubai and London. He returned with heavy security, but it did not deter the citizens of Pakistan from making a scene. As Musharraf arrived and departed the courthouse for his April 23rd hearing, locals on the side of the streets threw rocks at the former president. A gathering of around 150 lawyers shouted, "Dog, dog, Musharraf, dog," while 24 supporters chanted, "Long live Musharraf." Despite the charges against him, Pervez Musharraf let known his plan to return to politics and run for the seat in Pakistan's National Assembly. However, Pakistani officials made clear their decision to bar Musharraf from running for office by extending his house arrest. The elections, which are scheduled for May 11th, will be the first changeover between democratically elected, civilian-led governments in Pakistan's history. For Brittany Little, this has been Heidi Erbsen for The Global Current.
Finally, in news, Aitayo Akanji updates us on the recently foiled terrorist plot in Canada's Al-Qaeda connection.
In the wake of the collective worldwide shock of the double bombings at the Boston Marathon by the Tsarnaev brothers, Canadian authorities announced last week that they foiled a plot by 2 Al-Qaeda-linked operatives to derail a train between New York and Canada. Canadian authorities believe Rahid Jazza, 35, and his suspected accomplice, Chiseb Esega, 30, received directions and guidance from members of Al-Qaeda in Iran, an allegation which Iran has refuted. Information from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police (RCMP) said the surveillance operation leading to the arrest was a result of extensive collaborative efforts. It is believed that both the American Federal Bureau of Investigation and Canadian law enforcement agents took part in the operation that foiled the plot. The RCMP said the two men were not Canadian citizens and were supported by Al-Qaeda elements in Iran, although there doesn't seem to be any evidence of sponsorship by Tehran itself. Their plan was to derail a train operated by VIA Rail and kill and hurt people. RCMP Chief Superintendent Jennifer Strachan said the attack was definitely in the planning stage but not imminent. She continued, "We are alleging that these two individuals took steps and conducted activities to initiate a terrorist attack." She said, "They watched trains and railways in the Greater Toronto area." Canada has charged the two would-be terrorists with conspiring to carry out an attack and attempted murder in association with a terrorist group. The police were reportedly tipped off by a Muslim religious leader who became worried about one of the suspects' behavior. Canadian Public Safety Minister Vic Tours said the arrests are a testimony to the fact that terrorism is still a real threat to Canada. He warned in Parliament, "Canada will not tolerate terrorist activity and we will not be used as a safe haven for terrorists or those who support terrorist activity." Both suspects have made brief appearances in court. In a Montreal court, Esegaya declined to be represented by a court-appointed lawyer. He made a brief statement in French in which he called the allegations against him unfair. He alleged the conclusions were made based on acts and words which are only appearances. Jesser appeared in a Toronto court on Tuesday but did not enter a plea. He was given a court date of May 23rd. The court granted a request by his lawyer, John Norris, for immediate blackout on future evidence and testimony. Despite its alleged involvement, the Islamic Republic of Iran claims it had nothing to do with the plot, saying that Al-Qaeda and Iran do not share an ideology. In response to the allegations, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, Ramin Mamanparasat, said groups such as Al-Qaeda have no compatibility with Iran in both political and ideological fields. Mamanparasat berated the Canadian accusations as part of hostile Western policies against Iran. He counter-accused Canada of indirectly aiding Al-Qaeda by joining Western support for Syrian rebels, some of whom are known to have links with Al-Qaeda. Since 2008, when Canada anti-terrorism legislation recorded its first conviction, the number of terrorism-related arrests and prosecutions has steadily increased. Over 24 Canadians have been arrested or indicted on terrorism-related crimes in Canada and abroad, the vast majority inspired by Al-Qaeda. This news comes on the heels of an announcement by Algeria earlier last week that 2 Canadian Islamic militants were among the hostage takers in the standoff at the Amenas gas plant that cost the lives of more than 36 foreign workers. It's been Ehitayo Akanji for the Global Current.
In Analysis, staffer Adam Bergdorf explores the unfolding of the Israel-Palestine conflict within the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization.
One doesn't usually consider the issue of protecting historically significant sites as controversial. Under normal circumstances, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization's World Heritage List and its associated desire to preserve the universal heritage of mankind is seen as a laudable effort. However, since Palestine gained acceptance into the organization, UNESCO has become yet another battleground where the Israeli-Palestine conflict is playing out. The political backlash against Palestine's membership occurred almost immediately. Along with the United States, Israel stopped all funding to UNESCO when it voted to admit Palestine back in 2011. It is clear that, since gaining membership in UNESCO, Palestine has used the opportunity to further legitimize its claim to statehood and increase its international recognition. When Palestine began work on its list of proposed historical sites to the World Heritage List, a Palestinian Authority spokesperson stated, quote, "We believe that becoming a member of UNESCO is an overdue right for a country that has such a significant amount of heritage sites." Since its admission, Palestine has achieved several important political victories. In June of last year, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem was officially declared a World Heritage Site in Palestine. It was also granted emergency status based on the claim that it was in imminent danger due to continued fighting in the area. However, Palestine has also suffered several political setbacks. Last October, during the UNESCO Executive Board meeting in Paris, several resolutions condemning actions stemming from Israeli occupation of the West Bank, such as settlements in East Jerusalem and supposed censorship of Palestinian schools, failed to pass. Similar resolutions had easily passed at prior meetings, and the sudden reversal by member states like Russia, China, Venezuela, and even Syria took Palestine by surprise. A possible explanation was offered by Hilal Noor, the executive director of UN Watch, a pro-Israel UN watchdog group, who speculated that it had less to do with politics and more to do with finances. Since the withdrawal of U.S. funding, nearly 22% of UNESCO's budget, it is likely that the nations were expressing displeasure at the problems Palestine had caused, as well as a refocusing on its commitments rather than politics. Noor added, quote, "Ambassadors in Paris said, 'That's enough.'" The most recent developments in the Israel-Palestine UNESCO fight occurred just this month, and thankfully, they may signal a realization that the issues never should have been politicized in the first place. Both the Israeli government and Palestine have agreed to allow UNESCO back into the Old City of Jerusalem to monitor and assess several historic sites, such as the Western Wall and an ascent to the Temple Mount. In return for this access, Palestine has agreed to table several resolutions submitted to UNESCO that were highly critical of Israel and seen as largely political gestures. David T. Killian, the United States ambassador to UNESCO, stated the agreement, quote, "represents a critical step forward on depoliticizing UNESCO and signals a major shift towards a more constructive approach to cultural heritage issues." UNESCO Director General Irina Bokova also expressed hope for the agreement, and while not explicitly mentioning the political tension, certainly alluded to it in her statement, saying, quote, "I trust this agreement marks a turning point for all parties concerned to work together on the technical issues," adding, quote, "This type of technical collaboration lies at the heart of UNESCO's challenging mission to make dialogue possible between cultures and peoples." However, despite this momentary thaw in relations, there are still significant hurdles looming for the two nations. Earlier this month, the Hamas military wing bulldozed a section of the 3,000-year-old Mycenaean Anthedon Harbor in northern Gaza for use as a purported training ground. The Hamas-run Ministry of Tourism, the agency responsible for the upkeep of the site, claimed it was being utilized, quote, "due to the rising population in the region." The Anthedon Harbor was listed as a proposed World Heritage Site by Palestine in 2012, and their allowing its destruction has drawn sharp criticism from Israel. Conversely, though, Israel itself has received criticism for its plan to launch a Year of National Heritage to coincide with the country's Independence Day. The project is designed to highlight Jewish ties to many significant cultural sites, emphasizing the historic presence of the Jewish connection to the land. Although a majority of the sites marked for the project are located within Israel's borders, 8 of the sites are located in the contested West Bank. Since gaining membership nearly a year and a half ago, Palestine's presence has caused a traditionally positive, peaceable organization to become the central arena for heated political issues. Yet, UNESCO is also poised to take center stage in creating an environment where Israel and Palestine must work together in order to accomplish UNESCO's global mission to build peace in the minds of men and women. Adam Bergdorf, Global Current.
Staffer Stephanie Siegel analyzes the renewed controversy sparked by recent hunger strikes at Guantanamo Bay.
For the last 2 months, 63 Guantanamo Bay detainees have been on a hunger strike, protesting the U.S. government's refusal to grant them writ of habeas corpus. Despite President Obama's promise of shutting down Guantanamo Bay, he has failed to make good on his claims. Quote, "The U.S. is facing growing calls for the closure of Guantanamo Bay. In January 2009, Barack Obama signed an order that the prison facility should be closed within a year. Since then, the detainee population has fallen by 76, around 30%, but it remains open, writes Channel 4 News in the UK. As such, there are more than 150 detainees still in Guantanamo Bay, many of whom are being held indefinitely. The irony of Guantanamo's location in Cuba is that the United States has long criticized the communist Cuban government for human rights violations. Yet, the United States has opened a highly contested and internationally criticized facility that engages in the types of practices that it lambasts the Cuban government for carrying out. The current hunger strike has reopened the debate surrounding the facility as details of methods utilized against prisoners have emerged. In an op-ed to the New York Times, detainee Samir Naji al-Hassan Makbel writes, quote, "I will never forget the first time they passed the feeding tube up my nose. I can't describe how painful it is to be force-fed this way. As it was thrust in, it made me feel like throwing up. I wanted to vomit, but I couldn't. There was agony in my chest, throat, and stomach. I had never experienced such pain before. I would not wish this cruel punishment upon anyone." The fallout from this situation is two-pronged. First, the U.S. refusal to adhere to international law and the limits within its own constitution create a cause for illegitimizing its role as a leader of democracy. Its behavior mirrors authoritarian regimes. Additionally, Guantanamo Bay and the surrounding human rights abuses create a culture of hypocrisy as the United States continues to condemn countries that employ methods of torture. The second problematic situation that is a result of the Guantanamo Bay controversy is that it has developed an international reputation and has become a way to invalidate the U.S. while unifying terrorist movements. President Obama echoed these sentiments when he promised to close the prison. To shut down Guantanamo Bay, he said, quote, "would further the U.S.'s national security and foreign policy interests, as well as the interests of justice." He later said that Guantanamo had become a symbol that helped al-Qaeda recruit terrorists to its cause. The U.S. electorate, he said, had called for a new approach, quote, "one that recognized the imperative of closing the prison at Guantanamo Bay." The current hunger strike further exacerbates the tarnishing of the United States' global image, while simultaneously fostering additional resentment against the U.S. It is imperative that the Obama administration begins to charge and try the detainees or release them. Instead of using the detainees as political capital to assert his seemingly tough-on-terrorism foreign policy, President Obama must prioritize democracy and human rights. Stephanie Siegel, The Global Current.
Finally, executive producer Laura Toledo speaks with the director of the New American Foundation's Middle East Task Force, Leila Hilal, on recent developments out of Syria.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Ms. Hilal. This week began with the most recent Friends of Syria meeting in Istanbul and ended with the White House assessing to, quote, varying degrees of confidence that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons. How is a conflict that began over 2 years ago still ongoing to such a chaotic and frenzied extent?
I would say, generally speaking, that the reason why it's being dragged on for so long is because the revolution was turned into a proxy war. And by proxy war, I mean you have different external forces battling for primacy within Syria through different forces. You have Iran and Russia backing the regime, and you have Gulf countries, the U.S. and other Western countries supporting the opposition. Gulf states in particular are funneling money and weapons into Syria, which is driving the civil war. And then you have on the other side the Assad regime, which is conducting a very brutal campaign against its people with the backing, of Russia and Iran.
I see. So how are both sides seeking out this support? Because the world has been very hands-off so far. So what, in your view, is swaying other countries, leaders, or governments to take action in Syria?
The world has been hands-off in the sense that people keep asking the U.S. and other Western countries and Turkey to intervene to stop Assad's campaign against his people. And so we can say in that sense that there hasn't been international action. But there has been a lot of intervention in the country coming from Gulf states, from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, providing money and weapons to different actors on the ground, rebel forces that are trying to fight against the regime. And that process is one in which they are trying to win a battle against Iran, which is providing money and strategic guidance and even fighters for the Assad regime. So you have those external interventions ongoing. Now, why haven't we seen the U.S. intervene in Syria or NATO intervene in Syria as they did in Libya, as the U.S. did in Iraq? Part of the answer is that the Obama administration is wary to get involved in another conflict. Yesterday, in a press conference between President Obama and King Abdullah of Jordan, President Obama said that, yes, we have evidence of chemical weapons. And so they are admitting that there is some evidence, but the question is when, where, and how were these weapons used? And those answers apparently are determinative as to whether or not the red line has been crossed in the administration's talk. There's pressure on the Obama administration to admit the use of chemical weapons and to respond. There are many questions of what are the options. I think also you have to keep in mind that the conflict has been going on, as you said, for more than 2 years. We know that at least 70,000 people have been killed already, thousands detained, tortured, and millions that have fled the country, millions are displaced. The sad thing is that what's happening to the Syrian people is not considered a red line, but the use of chemical weapons is somehow. And given that the U.S. has not acted on the basis of such carnage that the people have suffered, it's hard for me to imagine that they would go in if small amounts of chemical weapons have been used.
Now, how are we getting information on either the weapons or particular skirmishes out there? Because UN peacekeepers were there last year, but then they had to leave amid increasing violence, and journalists have also been leaving the country.
There is a lot of intelligence gathering going on by the Israelis, by the U.S., by the Brits, but the primary mode of information is social media. There's been extensive filming and documentation of the fighting. Nearly every aspect of what's going on in Syria is somehow, in one way or the other, documented and posted, typically through YouTube. And then there is also many Syrians and journalists have very large network of activists inside the country, and those activists gather information and are talking to journalists through Skype. There's a constant flow of information. Now, there's some questions about being able to verify information, and therefore the numbers that we have are probably underestimating the true extent of the humanitarian crisis on the ground.
Looking towards the activists you spoke of and the opposition, you spoke with the New America Foundation last month about the leadership breakdown in the Syrian National Coalition. Now that it appears Khatib has indeed stepped down and George Sabra risen to caretaker leader, will the coalition's efforts or methods change, or will Sabra continue in Khatib's footsteps?
Muaz Khatib had called for political negotiations. He had suggested that those negotiations should be based on a few conditions. He articulated a platform that the rest of the coalition members did not agree with. So Khatib represented a unique line of thought. And now that he's gone, we're likely to see the coalition just continue business as usual. George Sabra is still the head of the Syrian National Council, which was the leading opposition bloc before the Syrian National Coalition was formed. So George Sabra has been on the political scene for quite a while and supports the insurgency as a way for ending the Assad regime. So we're likely to see the coalition continue along the lines as it's been previously.
So do you think focusing on the chemical weapons and trying to use that to galvanize support for either intervention or more aid in weapons, do you think that's not a good route to take, and instead a shift looking to political transitions should be taken?
The use of chemical weapons is something that can be used as leverage with Russia to say that, look, things are getting very serious, and can be leveraged by the U.S. and other actors to say, Russia, come to the table and stop backing the Assad regime at all costs and come back to an international consensus. The U.S. also needs to participate in that consensus by backing away from its ambivalent position on the issue of arming the insurgents and reposition itself toward a political process. So I think the use of chemical weapons should be leveraged, not necessarily for intervention, but for insisting that all countries come to the table and support a political process that will help the country achieve a transition that will end this civil war.
All right, well, thank you so much for taking the time. We do really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to this season's final broadcast of The Global Current. For more of The Global Current, Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and check out our blog at blogs.shu.edu/globalcurrent. This has been Alicia Sharabali. Have a great week.